minister essentially arranged for himself to have the ability to rule by decree indefinitely. And he's already used that in the context of this plague as a way to, for example, to manipulate how much money opposition political parties can receive and how much money municipalities that are controlled by opposition leaders can get during this period. So you already have a few examples around the world of this happening. And as I said, the question is how people, I mean, you began with the right point, which is that we don't know how long this is going to last. We don't know how people are going to feel about it a month or 2 months or 3 months from now. Powers that people have been willing to give up without protest now, will people feel the same about it in 3 months or 6 months?
Yeah, so I think that's one of the questions that we're going to have to think about. Is this transfer of power going to be permanent? But in some cases, even if it's not about something that's written down, it could be about a system or even a technology that's put in place at this time, which could subsequently be misused. And I'm thinking, for example, of Netanyahu's response, of this creation of an additional layer of surveillance in what is already a very highly observed society.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good example. So as you say, the Israelis brought in technology that they normally use to surveil terrorists, and they brought it in to monitor the movements of Israelis as a way of controlling the plague. I mean, there are versions of this that have been used very successfully in other countries. We know that in Taiwan and South Korea, Singapore, there have been experiments with using apps and with using phone trackers in order to find, so that people, for example, can be told, oh, you were standing within 100 meters of somebody who subsequently became ill, so that you can increase knowledge of people. I mean, and these are potentially very successful ways of controlling illness, and as you observed already, potentially ways of increasing totalitarian control later on. It seems to me, that right now is a really good time to have a conversation about how this kind of technology can be used. Is there a way to put it in place temporarily? Can you put time limits on it? Can you agree to have your phone tracked by, the sanitary officials, by the officials controlling the epidemic for, 6 months, but, with the guarantee that all the information disappears after a year. I mean, I have to tell you, I'm in Poland now. We came back here from, I had been in Britain. I came back here when I saw that the borders were going to close. And we had a 2-week quarantine here where we had to stay at home. And the police actually came to our house every day to check and make sure we were here. And that's the sort of 19th century version of these apps, that the police come and check on you. And, we understood what it was for. They were very polite. We didn't object to them and so on. But, if you ask me, is that something I want to have happen, 3 months from now when this is all over, or a year from now, even when it's over, no, obviously. So what we want to, what people should be doing now, if they agree to use these technologies and agree to this kind of surveillance, is they should just agree to build in an end date. Because yes, of course, there's obviously huge opportunities to exploit this once this is all over.
But, if you want to sort of make that point in some societies, then you would be perhaps accused of, it seems odd to say to be on the side of the disease, but there would be some kind of sort of rhetorical delegitimization of that question. So do you have a sense of what these rhetorical tactics are? Are some of them already being used by some of the...
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this has already been used by the Prime Minister of Hungary. He said that people who oppose his laws, are pro-virus, and he accused foreign critics of his laws of being, getting in the way of the Hungarian government, which is trying to stop a disease. In other words, you've begun to hear in a few places that any criticism of the regime or even of the democratically elected leaders can be interpreted as, you just want to spread disease. And that can be, we should watch out for this because that can be a very useful way of polarizing people, of somehow packaging this fear that people fear, this anxiety, and projecting it somewhere. I mean, this is I'm sure this is another way in which fear is going to be used. Particularly, I think, governments that have trouble controlling this, and in places where the healthcare system isn't functional, or where people become very panicked, you will see an attempt to blame somebody, whether it's blaming foreigners, whether it's blaming, I don't know, the European Union, whether it's blaming minorities inside your own country. This is going to be another tactic that people will use when there's a lot of fear and anxiety. The rulers don't want it directed at them, and so they're going to try and ensure that it's directed at somebody else, whether or not they have people who have anything to do with it. I mean, you're in India. Maybe you can tell me what's happening there.
Well, yes, I think I'm going to want to come back to that in a bit. Definitely over here in India, there is a sense in which across social media, and perhaps thanks to some skewed reporting, thanks to some government briefings, people are being encouraged to think that religious minorities in particular are more responsible for the spread of the virus than the rest of us. But we're going to come back to that in a moment. I wanted to sort of follow up on another aspect of what you said, and about this sort of rhetorical advantage that maybe strongmen have. And one of the interesting things about a lot of the authoritarians that we have around the world is that they don't necessarily take all the right decisions, but they are popular for their apparent ability to take any decision at all, rather than their predecessors of the sort of old technocratic liberal age, who might have thought a lot, might have been constrained by vetoes, by complex coalitions in power, and were seen as not acting enough. At a moment like a pandemic, it seems to me that there is a giant political advantage, just on behalf of acting, doing anything at all. And isn't that exactly what these strongman types are already good at?
Yes, you're right. Although I would say that with a little bit of nuance. You're absolutely right that the ability to look like you're doing something, to shut the border, whatever, isolate people, quarantine people, shut people in their houses, all of that looks like success, or it looks like filling a vacuum at a current moment. But I do think that, again, keeping in mind where you started, which is that we're just at the beginning of this and we don't know how it's going to play out later on. I think that the real dividing line after some weeks and months is going to be not between authoritarians and Democrats, but it's going to be between kind of states with successful and competent bureaucracies and those who don't have it. And that's actually a different line, because it's one thing to sort of do gesture politics and use slogans and, as I say, shut the borders, and all that. It's another thing to be effective, and to actually control the disease. And by the way, and save the economy, which is going to be another huge problem. It's already begun, and it's only going to get worse over the next few weeks. And people who bluff, people who make stuff up, people whose popularity is based on big disinformation campaigns, people who don't use science and haven't been, and who haven't built up an infrastructure of competent bureaucrats, but have instead been employing, toadies and, time wasters and their people's cousins, in important state jobs. People who haven't built an infrastructure of competence are down the line, I think, going to pay a price for it this time, because this is a real challenge. It's not a fake, made up, immigration crisis that you can conjure up out of nothing and, some Facebook, campaigns. This is a real, it's a real virus. It's really killing people. And the economic crash that's following is really going to cost people their jobs. And so a lot, I think, is going to depend on who is really competent and who isn't. And I think in the democratic world, it's already clear that there are going to be some states which are more competent. I've mentioned, South Korea and Taiwan already. It's pretty clear that Germany is ahead of some of its other European counterparts already in its ability to test and track the disease. Switzerland is quite far ahead. Iceland is far ahead. There are a number of countries where, where you see them having a lot of success. And also, by the way, there are a lot of authoritarian states that are in trouble. It's very possible that Russia is in trouble. It's not 100% clear what's coming out there or what's going on there because we don't have good statistics. We knew at the very beginning it was clear that people had the disease and it wasn't being reported. So we don't really understand how far it's moved or exactly what the results are. But already, the Russian president has had to cancel a planned, World War II celebration. He's postponed a referendum. There's a chance that his authority may be challenged. So I think that over the next weeks and months, we'll see trouble in some autocratic states, the ones that have been bluffing, and we'll see some success in some democratic states as well. So, it's going to be, it's almost like the rules have shifted. People who were good at creating these fake conflicts and polarizing society and creating, lots of anger and hatred, they were doing pretty well, a year ago. Right now, actually, there's a premium that's going to be placed on people who are actually good at governing, and that's a completely different category of behavior.
Is it different also in the sense that, one of the things that I know you have said in the past that that a lot of these authoritarians share is a public disdain, disapproval of sort of meritocratic expertise. And, they represent the people, they have a clearer understanding and grasp of what the problems are than the expert class did. This appears to be the kind of thing where ideally, you would want the expert class to have a voice, to have a say, to have a larger share in the decisions made by the government than a lot of authoritarians have been comfortable with. Will that sort of change the way that we view, that the public views this kind of strongman image?
It might. You can see already in a number of countries, you can see that the people that everyone really wants to hear from are the scientists and the epidemiologists and the virologists. There's a reason why President Trump has these doctors who show up with him at his daily press conferences, because they engender more trust right now than he does. And this is being shown by polling. There's a reason why, scientists lead the South Korean equivalent of that. There's a reason why people are putting scientists forward because, they have something real to say. The difficulty, of course, is the science of this is changing all the time, as we learn more and more about this new virus. And so it's not as if science has a single golden answer that's going to explain everything. But generally speaking, this is a moment when, yes, you're right, suddenly, meritocracy looks good. We want the best doctors and we want the best scientists and we want the best modelers and we want, people with the best ability to cope with economic crisis in charge right now. We don't want somebody's cousin. We don't want, the longtime party member, who's been allowed to climb the ladder because he's loyal to the leader. We don't want those people in charge. We want actual experts. And I think, again, this could be while you're right that this is a moment when autocrats are going to take power, it's also a moment when, in a number of places, the things might play out a little bit differently, and people begin to ask for, the experts to come back.
In the 2008 crisis, which led to both the sort of economic fallout across the world, of course, but also a kind of political rethinking of a lot of our priorities over time. One of the things that came out of that was that you had the leaders of the People's Republic of China standing up and saying, look, we didn't do this. We never gave this kind of financial sector that much space, but also we've survived this. and we're the engine of growth that has survived this, and we're going to go from country to country in the world, investing here, helping, buying your raw materials, etc. And they turned into the sort of saviors of a large part of the emerging world in the years that followed. Now, regardless of where the virus evolved, which we know it did in Wuhan, but we're not holding the Chinese state responsible for the evolution of that. What we are hearing a lot is that from representatives of the Chinese state that, guys, we fixed it. We dealt with this so much better than everybody else. We have this strong surveillance authoritarian state. We had no warning when this came to us. But what happened was that because we have this strong state, we shut everything down. Everyone followed instructions, and we've gotten out of it before everybody else. Now, of course, there are questions to be asked at this point about whether indeed they've gotten out of it. There have been questions to be asked about whether they made the right choices at various points. But do you think that we're at a point where that kind of argument about the nature of the Chinese state, where you have both a strong man and this extraordinarily effective local bureaucracy, these two things will come together, and we'll start saying, okay, the Chinese have got something sorted. They know how to deal with the crisis.
So, it's a fascinating question. I've been thinking about this over the last couple of days. You're right. On the one hand, the Chinese, partly because it did originate there and they knew where it was to begin with, whereas we didn't. The Chinese do seem to have controlled it, although, as you say, there's some questions about how real that control is. And thus, they've been in a position over the last few weeks to, for example, to do these very spectacular PR events where they deliver masks and even doctors to European countries or to, I think there was a recent one in Pakistan, and there have been a number of other countries as well, and where the plane opens up and there's a television camera at the tarmac, and the prime minister comes and welcomes the plane and so on. We've had this, clearly orchestrated in a number of countries. The Chinese helping the world, and I'm not. We'll see how effective that is. I mean, it's an interesting question. Given how hapless and how uncoordinated the American reaction has been, and how little the Trump administration has been involved in any international conversation about this. I mean, there is a way in which the Chinese are clearly trying to take advantage of that and are setting themselves up as, the power that can instruct and help the world. I mean, as you know, the trouble with that narrative is that we all also know that this virus came from China. And we also know that however successfully they claim to have controlled it inside their country, they did not stop it from spreading. They did not prevent planes from leaving Wuhan. They did not, they didn't stop it from getting out to the rest of the world. And there, as you know, I'm sure viewers of this program know there are enormous numbers of questions about the origin of the virus. Why was knowledge of it suppressed at first? Did it really come from a wet market? Did it come from one of the labs that's in Wuhan? Was it actually an accidentally escaped virus that scientists were working on? Why wasn't that information known, and why isn't it better studied? In other words, there are all those sets of questions around China. I think it's almost like you have now competition between those two narratives. Okay, Chinese authoritarianism, we shut it down. Now we can deliver, masks, face masks to the world on the one hand. On the other hand, Chinese authoritarianism, yeah, you suppressed the story of the virus. You allowed it to be created and to spread. You didn't stop it when you could have stopped it. You have those two kind of competing stories now about China. And you can see them playing out in different countries in different ways, actually, depending on the politics of the given country. I actually think that this event will, in Europe at least, in Europe and the United States, this may have the effect of galvanizing people, not so much against China, but kind of creating an enormous wariness of China and fear about what relying on China and Chinese production and Chinese, supply chains means. So, whereas I can imagine in other places, the disappearance of the United States, and the divisiveness of Europe will have the opposite effect. I can imagine, there are countries in which China's status and so on will be improved. But those two narratives, that's the thing to watch over the next few weeks and months, because those two competing stories about China you're going to hear them everywhere in both countries, and we'll see who wins.
But to return to a point that you sort of made briefly earlier, part of the reason why we have why we're sort of focused on that particular competition between these two narratives, is because the competition such as it was between the US and China seemed to have, as you said, the US response has been so confused. But more than that, it seems to me that you could say it has been counterproductive, in the sense that early stories existed that the Trump administration wanted to perhaps buy entire companies in Germany, for example, that might have a chance at producing a vaccine quicker, and in order to ensure that vaccine was reserved for US use. And isn't that really not the kind of thing one would expect from, leader of the free world kind of country?
Look, this is an administration that, they took office saying they were nationalists, that they didn't believe in international organizations and institutions, that they, America first and all that. And it's been, they've pursued that in a very strange way. A lot of the time it seems not so much America first, but Trump and his family first. Not everything that the president has done has seemed designed to benefit Americans. It seems more designed to benefit. It's almost like his political choices are designed to benefit him. But they have effectively, they've undermined their relationships, America's relationships with its closest allies. Europeans have kind of given up on the United States. They've undermined relationships with others around the world. And in this crisis, we see the effect of it. As a friend of mine, a sort of former European prime minister, actually said to me a couple of days ago, it's not just that the U.S. is failing. We've had U.S. failure before. We've had the Americans try to organize things, and it doesn't work. In this crisis, there's not even a hint that the Americans are trying to do anything. Like there's no G7, there's no G20, there's no, the U.S. isn't standing together with the WHO. There are a lot of problems with the WHO, but there's no U.S. effort to fix the WHO. There's nothing. There's no discussion of, what are we going to do about international flights or international trade? There's nothing. They're absent. The only very, very striking, there was a G7 foreign ministers meeting. They didn't even sign a joint statement at the end of it because the American Secretary of State Pompeo insisted on using the expression Wuhan virus in the statement. And the other foreign ministers, European foreign ministers and the Japanese, were so annoyed by that they refused to sign it. So that's the level of, kind of playground stupidity that we're at. We don't have any U.S. leadership. And I don't think actually most Americans are aware of the degree to which the absence of the United States is shocking to people. And, coupled with, it's hard to even find the language to describe it. These idiotic statements of the American president, that maybe we should try injecting people with bleach, to see if that cures the virus. So, it's kind of jaw-dropping. Nobody can understand it. I see jokes being made about it in multiple languages, all over the world. So we have a really poignant and extraordinary moment. The U.S. is absent. We have a president who's not up to this moment. There's a lot of, by the way, good things happening in the U.S. There's, fantastic governors. There's some amazing mayors. The U.S. biotech industry has got going and, is producing things very quickly. It's very possible that many of the scientific advances are going to come from the United States. It's not like the United States isn't going to contribute. They will. It's just that the absence of the federal government, the American government, is so amazing that it does leave, in theory, as I said, this opportunity for the Chinese to step in. Whether that will work, whether it will be effective, whether people aren't just going to be too suspicious of China is hard to tell.
Well, I think that it's sort of almost ironic. It's 100 years since, just over 100 years since the end of the First World War, and I think in that time this is the first major global crisis where people have not automatically looked to see,
Yeah.
How is the US going to lead us through it, and that's
Yeah.
a very unusual and interesting moment.
Yeah.
Okay, I think that we're about at our Q&A time. So let me see what the questions that have been sent in are. Right. So here's one. Here's from a gentleman named Sachdev Ramakrishna, and it says, well, it's sort of an idealistic, but actually a question worth thinking about. And he asks, wouldn't it be easier for governments to just find efficient ways to deal with the pandemic and thereby gain popularity with the population rather than piggybacking on external events, riding on fear and emotion?
I mean, that's the question, and I mean, there are some governments that are trying to do that. I mean, that's, what is the Swiss government trying to do? It's trying to use effective tactics. And by the way, the South Korean government, which apparently is, shooting up in popularity because of their effective use of contact tracing and so on, but there are some leaders and some authoritarian countries, and also in some democracies, who are not competent and who do not have a good bureaucracy and who do not know how to use the science, or who don't have, national diagnostic industries who can help it. So the reason why you're seeing this use of fear and this kind of manipulation and this let's change the subject and all that is that those are the states, those are the leaders who can't do it. I mean, they are, left without a good bureaucratic and medical response to the crisis. They're left with, making stuff up and using disinformation campaigns.
Thanks. Well, then there's a question from Mudit Jain, who asks, do you think, I suppose, given that government services and departments, and many of them are making a hash of handling the pandemic, do you think that they will, what he said is, do you think government services and governments themselves will be outsourced? But I think what he means is there the balance of power between the public and the private sector, since presumably any real solutions will come now from the private sector? Do you think that balance is being shifting yet again?
I mean, this will play out differently in different countries. I mean, in the United States, meant that there was this big role for private business. I mean, that's true. And it's true that, that I suspect, I think the medical innovation will come from the private sector. Quite a lot of, many of the diagnostics and so on, that will come from the private sector. And there's like a huge role for the private sector, particularly the medical biotech industry, to play here. The question is, though, some of the decisions that have to be taken and some of the measures that have to be taken it's just not possible for the private sector to do it. I mean, social distancing, isolation, quarantine, contact tracing, all those, all the kind of non-medical approaches to the pandemic, all the behavioral approaches, that all requires, bureaucratic or government intervention. I mean, if we get a vaccine,
apparently Google and Apple think they can do it themselves.
So far, they haven't. Let's just say that, and there will have to be, in order for people to participate and to make sure that it's, 100% of the population is covered, there has to be some entity, some with that has everybody's interest at heart, that is some entity more, at some different level from Google and Apple, and so so I can imagine Google and Apple designing the systems in order to get people to obey them and get people to adopt them, and find ways to coordinate and use them. You are going to need some kind of, whether it's local government or national government, or I'm not saying it necessarily has to be it all has to be at the same level, but there'll have to be some government involvement. When we get to the stage of vaccines being invented, assuming we get to that stage, then we're talking about something different. Then maybe it will make more sense for the private sector to deliver, vaccines, or maybe there will be, that's too far down the road to speculate about. But so I'm not denying that there's a role for the private sector. It's just that in these mass, if you need to do a mass behavioral change, of a kind that none of us have really in our lifetimes experienced. I mean, nothing on this scale that anybody can remember since the 1918 pandemic. You were talking about World War One. Then we need some kind of state involvement, and that's why you've had state involvement up until now.
Great, thank you. A couple more questions. I think I'm going to mash two of them together because they're in some ways pretty similar. One from Sanya, who says, in India, we wonder if the number of COVID-19 cases is well below the actual figure. Do you think that there may be an effort in some countries to put the incorrect statistics out to change the way the people think about a political leader? Would it be helpful for that kind of leader? So that's question one. And I think the related question is, how can governments manage the effect of, actually, no, that's not related. But why don't you take that one? I mean, sort of interesting, this management of statistics, data, the narrative. Are people buying it?
Well, so lots and lots of speculation that this is happening already in many countries. Firstly, in China, where it's thought by many people for all kinds of reasons, that even the death rate in Wuhan was much higher than was let on. So that's number one. In Russia, it was very clear that at least for some weeks at the beginning of the pandemic, the Russians were denying they had any cases, and yet Russian hospitals were full of people with, pneumonia, and there were all kinds of reports from doctors describing what they thought to be the pandemic having already arrived. Here, where I'm in Poland, it's been argued, and it seems true that the government is downplaying the number of cases by having deaths from the virus being registered as something else. So you die from one thing and it's registered as another thing. And that's because of a very complicated piece of politics here to do with the fact that we're supposed to have elections in a couple of weeks. And it's still not clear whether these elections are actually going to take place. There's been no campaign. There's been no, it's not clear how the ballots will be worked. Local governments are saying they won't organize this ballot. And it's, but for its own reasons, the government really wants this election. Sorry?
The polls shifted at all?
It's complicated because something like 70% of the country says it doesn't want to vote. So it will be a very tiny turnout. The government wants the election to go forward because they think that this is the one chance for their candidate to win, because they think if they postpone it till the fall, after the economic crisis kicks in, he'll lose. So that that's a whole long complicated piece of politics. But one of the one of the methods that it is thought that they are using is they've manipulated the death statistics so that it looks lower here than it should, in order to make people feel all right about these elections, which may or may not happen on May the 10th. We still don't know. But yeah, I mean, they're clearly in. This is another reason why democracies have some advantage over dictatorships in this, because transparency is one of the ways in which we can fight this thing. The more we know about it, the more we know how many people really have it, how many people died from it, the more testing we can do, the more sense we have of its scale and how it's really affecting the population, the more intelligent our decisions will be, the more intelligent we can be about lockdowns and so on. So the cover up of deaths is bad for all of us, because the cover up doesn't help us fix the problem. But yeah, I mean, your questioner is absolutely right. I mean, of course, people who have the ability to manipulate the numbers are going to do so.
Well, I think we're almost out of time, and I have time for one last question. So I'll take something that sort of amused me a bit, and that's from Linda Hoyset, who asks, what was behind your thinking to ride out the pandemic in Poland instead of the US? Was it simply a family decision, or were there other issues, healthcare or politics or something else, that informed your decision?
So I have a complicated life. I have, allegiances in different places, but the only house I own, the only house that is mine, is here in Poland. My husband is Polish. And this is our house. This is where I am. And when I realized that, borders were going to close, and that I was going to have to make a decision about where to be for maybe months, I wanted to be in my own house, and so we actually, it was a very dramatic, I came back here at the last minute. We got one of our sons in. He wound up having to walk across the border because all the ways to get into Poland were already closed, and we picked him up on the other side. So we all sort of dramatically reunited here from the different places where we were. But it was a sentimental attachment to this particular place, and to a place where I knew that my family could all meet. And I'm happy to be here despite everything.
Right, thank you. And I think we're all done on time. I just want to thank a lot of the people who sent in questions that I haven't been able to get to. A lot of them are really smart, and I'm sort of sorry I couldn't ask them.
We'll have to do it again. Yeah,
we'll have to do it again. But thanks a lot, and thank you, Anne. And over to you, Sanjay.
Thank you so much, Mihir. Thank you, Anne. Absolutely, we need to do it again. The whole issue of transparency that you talked about, really need to look at that in detail. But glad to hear that you're safe with your family in Poland, and I hope you continue to be safe in these times. Thank you all for watching and being such a great audience. We're really sorry that Mihir couldn't take all your questions. They were streaming in fast and furious, but perhaps we'll forward some of them to Anne and see if we can get her to answer some more of them. Please remember to tune in at 9 p.m. Indian Standard Time for our next session. This will be 4:30 p.m. British Summer Time and at 11:30 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. The session is Akbar, Ira Mukhoti in conversation with Manu Pillai. Akbar was the most admired of all of the Mughal emperors and one of only 2 Indian rulers to be widely known as the Great. Here, Mukhoti talks about her groundbreaking study with fellow historian Manu Pillai. For those of you who are willing to stay logged on, we have an extract from the Jaipur Music Stage archives. Saeed Zahoor Ahmed is a leading Sufi musician. He has spent most of his life singing in Sufi shrines and didn't produce a first album until 2006, when he was nominated for the BBC World Music Awards based on word of mouth. He emerged as the best BBC Voice of the Year in 2006. He mostly sings compositions of the major Sufi poets and gained widespread recognition and fame with the several performances on Coke Studio. This is a short extract of his performance from the Jaipur Music Stage. Remember, do log on at 9 p.m. Indian Standard Time. Thank you both. That was fabulous.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Mihir.
चल बुलिया चलो उठे चलीए वे जिते होवन अकाल दे ना कोई तेरी जात पछाने वे हैया ना कोई तैनो सदके पाक कुरान जिंदवारा नबी दी शान तू जिंदवारा नबी दी शान तू जिन्ना हकदारा विखाया है उना झूठ मना फरमाया है ਸਾਈਂ ਜ਼ੋਰ دیਵਾਨਾ ਕਹਿੰਦਾ ਏ ਉਹ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਨਾਮ ਅੱਲਾ ਦਾ ਲੈਂਦਾ ਏ ਅੱਲਾ 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 ਤੁੰਬਾ ਕਹਿੰਦਾ ਏ ਅੱਲਾ 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 ਤੁੰਬਾ ਕਹਿੰਦਾ ਏ ਅੱਲਾਹੂ 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 अमीर खुसरो निज़ामुद्दीन आया अमीर खुसरो निज़ामुद्दीन आया जिन्ने सुर संगीत चलाया उन्हें दम दम विरद कमाया अड़ कलमा ते दीन जगाया है साईं ज़ोर दीवाना कहंदा है जेड़ा नाम अल्लाह दा लैंदा है अल्लाह 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 तुंबा कहंदा है अल्लाह 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 तुंबा कहंदा है अल्लाहू Allahu, Allahu, Allahu. Nah